Sometimes life brings you to your knees before it shows you why you needed to fall. Elias knew that feeling well when he lost his job and found himself alone in a cabin deep in the woods, wondering if he'd ever find his way back. One morning, he heard a small cry in the fog. A black panther cub was trapped in old wire, starving and afraid. Elias freed it and walked away. But the cub followed him home. It kept coming back, day after day. Then one morning, it brought him a rusted key. Where did a wild animal find a key? What did it want him to discover? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that most people had forgotten existed. Elias had found it through a friend of a friend, someone who knew he needed distance from everything his life had become. The rent was cheap because the place was basic: one bedroom, a wood stove, a porch that creaked with every step. But it had windows that looked out onto forest so thick you couldn't see more than 50 yards in any direction. And that was exactly what he needed. Elias Hartley was 42 years old, though some mornings he felt twice that. He'd been an engineer once, the kind of job that came with a decent salary and the promise of security. For 15 years, he'd worked for the same firm, designing systems for water treatment plants. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered, or at least he'd thought it did, until the company restructured and his entire department disappeared in a single afternoon. They'd called it downsizing. He'd called it the end of everything he'd built. The divorce had come 2 years before that, but losing his job felt like the second shoe finally dropping. His ex-wife, Nora, had been patient for a long time. Patient through the late nights, the missed dinners, the slow drift of two people who'd stopped really talking to each other. When she finally said she wanted out, Elias hadn't fought it. He'd been too tired, too buried in his own exhaustion to fight for anything. Their daughter, Iris, had been 14 then, 16 now. She lived with Nora in the city, 2 hours away by car, but feeling much farther most days. Iris was a good kid, smart, compassionate, with her mother's practical nature and what Nora used to call Elias's stubborn streak. They talked on the phone twice a week, video calls where Elias tried to sound more together than he felt. She never pressed him about when he was coming back, but he could hear the question in her voice anyway. On the cabin's mantel, between a stack of field guides and a half-empty bottle of whiskey he rarely touched anymore, sat a photograph in a simple wooden frame. It showed the three of them at the coast 5 years ago. Iris was 11, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding up a sand dollar she'd found. Nora was laughing at something Elias had said, her hand shading her eyes from the sun. And Elias himself looked genuinely happy, his arm around his wife's shoulders, no shadows under his eyes yet. He kept the photo there as a reminder, not of what he'd lost, though it was that too, but of what he needed to find his way back to, not the marriage that was gone, and he'd made peace with it, but the man in that photo, the one who could make his wife laugh and his daughter smile, who believed he had something to offer the world. That man had been missing for a long time. The mornings were Elias's favorite part of living here. He'd wake with the dawn, make coffee on the propane stove, and sit on the porch watching the mist rise from the forest floor. The Pacific Northwest had a particular quality of light in autumn, something golden and ancient that filtered through the towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. Sometimes he'd see deer picking their way through the underbrush. Once, a black bear had wandered past, close enough that Elias could hear it breathing. After coffee, he'd hike. There were old logging roads that crisscrossed the forest, most of them overgrown but still navigable. He'd walk for 2 or 3 hours, letting his mind empty out, letting the silence work on him the way nothing else could. He'd tried therapy after the divorce. The therapist had been kind, professional, full of useful suggestions that Elias couldn't seem to follow. But out here, with nothing but birdsong and the sound of his own footsteps, he found something close to peace. In the afternoons, he'd work on his laptop, sending out job applications that rarely got responses. The engineering field had moved on without him, or at least that's how it felt. Younger candidates with newer certifications, people who hadn't taken 8 months off to find themselves in the woods. He'd started doing freelance technical writing, small projects that barely covered his expenses but kept him busy enough to feel less useless. Evenings were for woodworking. He'd found tools in the cabin's shed, old but serviceable, and had started making things. Simple things at first. A shelf, a cutting board, a small box with dovetail joints. The work calmed him, required focus and precision, reminded him that his hands could still create something worthwhile. He'd shipped a jewelry box to Iris for her birthday last month. She'd sent him a photo of it on her dresser, filled with the sea glass and unusual stones she collected. His own father lived 3 hours north, in the same house where Elias had grown up. They hadn't spoken in over a year. The relationship had cooled gradually over decades, a slow accumulation of disappointments and misunderstandings that neither of them knew how to address. Elias's mother had been the bridge between them, but she'd passed away 6 years ago, and without her, the two men had simply drifted into silence. Elias thought about calling sometimes, especially on the long evenings, but he never quite managed to dial the number. Mrs. Kowalski lived in the only other cabin within a mile, an older woman who'd retired here after teaching elementary school for 30 years. She kept to herself mostly, but she'd stop by once with a casserole and a warning about the mountain lions that occasionally passed through. "They're more scared of you than you are of them," she'd said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of that herself. The locals in the nearest town, 15 miles down the mountain, had a different relationship with the forest. They told stories over coffee at the general store, tales passed down from their grandparents about strange things in the deep woods, ruins from old logging camps, cave systems that went on for miles, a wealthy eccentric from the 30s who'd bought up thousands of acres and then vanished without a trace. Elias had listened politely, filing the stories away as the kind of folklore every isolated place accumulates. But sometimes, deep in the forest on his morning hikes, he'd find things that made him wonder. A stone foundation where no building should have been, rusted equipment that seemed too deliberate in its placement to be abandoned randomly, trees marked with carvings so old the bark had grown around them, leaving only fragments of symbols visible. The forest had secrets. Elias had come to understand that. Whether those secrets mattered to anyone anymore was a different question. At night, lying in bed with the wood stove crackling and the darkness pressing against the windows, Elias would think about his life in phases. There was, before the divorce, when he'd been too busy to notice he was unhappy. There was, after the divorce, when the unhappiness became impossible to ignore. And then there was the layoff, which had somehow been both devastating and clarifying. Without the job to hide behind, he'd been forced to look at himself directly. He didn't particularly like what he saw. A man who'd let fear make his decisions, who'd chosen security over passion, comfort over growth, who'd been so afraid of failing that he'd stopped trying anything that mattered. His marriage had died from that same fear, from his inability to be vulnerable, to fight for what he wanted instead of just accepting what came. But here, in this cabin at the end of a forgotten road, Elias had started to believe he might still have time to change. He was 42, not dead. Iris still needed a father who could show her what resilience looked like, and somewhere inside himself, buried under all the disappointment and self-doubt, there was still that man from the photograph, the one who could be brave when it mattered. He just needed to figure out what mattered. The fog came in thick that morning, the kind that turned the forest into something from an old story. Elias almost stayed in, but restlessness won out. He laced up his hiking boots, filled a thermos with coffee, and headed out into the grey. The world felt muffled. His footsteps seemed too loud, and yet they disappeared into the fog within seconds. He couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. The trail he usually followed was barely visible, just a slightly darker line through the undergrowth. He moved carefully, alert in a way he wasn't on clear mornings. He'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the chatter of squirrels or the warning call of a jay, but something smaller, weaker. A cry that made him stop walking and tilt his head, trying to locate it. There, off to his left, maybe 30 yards into the brush. Elias hesitated. The sensible thing would be to keep walking. Wild animals in distress were dangerous, unpredictable, but the sound came again, plaintive and afraid, and he found himself pushing through the undergrowth toward it. He almost walked past without seeing. The fog concealed it so well that he was within 10 feet before his eyes resolved what he was looking at. A black panther cub, no more than a few months old, tangled in old wire fencing that had been left to rust among the ferns. The wire had caught around its hind leg and across its chest. The cub had clearly been struggling for a long time. Its fur was matted, its body thin to the point of emaciation. When it saw Elias, it tried to scramble away and only succeeded in tightening the wire's grip. A small, desperate sound escaped its throat. Elias's first thought was that this was impossible. Black panthers didn't exist here. They were melanistic leopards or jaguars, animals from completely different parts of the world. His second thought was that the cub was going to die if someone didn't help it. He approached slowly, hands visible, making soft sounds he hoped were calming. The cub watched him with eyes that seemed too aware, too intelligent. It had stopped struggling, as if it understood that fighting only made things worse. Elias could see blood where the wire had cut into its leg. "Easy now," he said quietly. "I'm going to help you, but you need to stay still." He had a multi-tool in his pocket. He always carried it on hikes. He knelt carefully beside the cub, close enough now to smell the fierce scent coming off it, to see how its ribs pressed against its sides. The wire was old, but still strong, twisted around the cub in a way that would require careful cutting. His daughter's voice echoed in his mind, something she'd said on their last call. "You always taught me that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." Elias reached for the wire. The cub tensed, but didn't strike. He worked the multi-tool's wire cutters around the first strand, positioned near the cub's chest. One cut, then another. The wire sprang free with a soft ping. The cub flinched but held still. Elias moved to the leg, the trickiest part. The wire had wrapped twice around, embedded slightly in the fur and skin. He had to slide his fingers underneath, feeling the warmth of the cub's body, the rapid flutter of its heartbeat. "Almost there," he murmured. The final cut freed the leg. The cub immediately pulled away, stumbling on the injured limb, but managing to put a few feet of distance between them. It stood there, sides heaving, watching him. Elias stood slowly, backing away. "You're free now. Go on. Find your mother if you can." The cub didn't move. It just kept watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. After a long moment, Elias turned and walked back toward the trail, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He didn't look back until he reached the path. When he did, the fog had swallowed the place where he'd left the cub. He couldn't see anything but grey. The walk home felt longer than usual. His mind kept returning to what he'd just done, the impossibility of it. A black panther cub in the Pacific Northwest. How had it gotten here? Had someone been keeping exotic animals illegally? The wire suggested human activity, something abandoned or forgotten. None of it made sense. Back at the cabin, he showered and made lunch, but he couldn't shake the image of those eyes, the intelligence in them. The way the cub had seemed to understand he was trying to help. He pulled up his laptop and started researching, falling down a rabbit hole of articles about melanistic big cats, exotic animal trafficking, private collections that sometimes released animals when they couldn't care for them anymore. When Iris called that evening, he told her about it. He couldn't help himself. "Dad, that's incredible," she said, her face bright on the screen. "Are you going to tell someone? Like wildlife services?" "I don't know," Elias admitted. "Part of me thinks I should, but another part worries they'll just capture it, put it in a zoo somewhere. It saved you though, right? I mean, you saved it. That has to mean something." Elias smiled. "You sound like your mother, always looking for the meaning in things. Mom's practical. I get the romantic stuff from you," Iris said. "You should go back tomorrow. Make sure it's okay." He did go back, though he wasn't sure what he expected to find. The fog had lifted, leaving the forest bright and clear. He found the place where he'd freed the cub, the cut wires still lying in the ferns, but no sign of the animal itself. He stood there for a while, feeling oddly disappointed, then headed back. The cub was waiting at the edge of his property. Elias stopped so suddenly he nearly lost his balance. The cub sat near the tree line, maybe 50 feet from the cabin, in a patch of morning sun. It looked healthier somehow, more alert. When it saw him, it stood, but didn't run. "What are you doing here?" Elias said aloud. The cub tilted its head, an oddly dog-like gesture. Then it turned and melted back into the forest. The next morning, it was there again. Same spot, same patient waiting. Elias watched from the porch, his coffee growing cold in his hands. This wasn't normal behavior. Wild animals, especially ones that had been trapped and hurt, didn't seek out human contact. They certainly didn't return to the same place repeatedly. On the third morning, Elias brought out a plate of raw chicken he'd bought in town. He set it on the ground halfway between the cabin and the tree line, then retreated to the porch. The cub emerged, approached the food cautiously, and ate. It looked up at him once while eating, and Elias could have sworn he saw gratitude in that glance. By the end of the week, he'd established a routine. Morning, feeding, a few minutes of observation. Then the cub would disappear into the forest. Elias told himself it was temporary, that once the cub was strong enough it would leave on its own. But deep down, he knew something had changed. This animal had chosen him for some reason he didn't yet understand. And in choosing him, it had given him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Elias started calling the cub Shadow, though only in his mind. Naming it felt like claiming ownership, and he knew better than that. But the name stuck anyway, fitting for an animal that moved like darkness itself, appearing and disappearing with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. The feeding routine became the anchor of his days. Shadow would appear at dawn, wait while Elias brought out food, and eat while keeping one eye on him. Gradually, the distance between them shrank. First 50 feet, then 40, then 30. Elias never pushed it, never tried to approach. He simply sat on his porch steps with his coffee and let Shadow decide the pace. In the afternoons, while Shadow was gone, Elias researched. What he found both fascinated and worried him. Black panthers, melanistic leopards, weren't native to North America. The fact that one was here, apparently thriving in the wild, suggested either an illegal breeding operation or someone's exotic pet that had escaped or been released. Either way, it was complicated. Possibly illegal for him to be feeding it. Definitely illegal if he was harboring it knowingly. But the more he learned about big cats, the more certain he became that Shadow was special. The cub showed problem-solving abilities that went beyond normal animal behavior. The way it had led him to specific spots in the forest, waiting until he noticed things. Small things at first, a broken branch that revealed an old trail, unusual stones arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. 2 weeks after their first encounter, Shadow led him to a stream about a mile from the cabin. The cub sat beside a fallen log and waited, its gaze fixed on something beneath the rotted wood. When Elias approached and moved the log aside, he found it, a torn piece of leather, aged and water-stained but still intact. It was a page from a journal. The leather had protected it somewhat, though the ink was badly faded. Elias could make out fragments, sketches of big cats, notes about specimens and protection, a date he could barely read that looked like 1934. At the bottom, partially legible, "Project sunk." The rest was lost to water damage and time. Elias photographed the page with his phone, then carefully placed it in a plastic bag he'd brought for collecting interesting rocks. His hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just a random artifact. Someone had been here, in these woods, doing something with big cats nearly a century ago. That evening, he spread his findings on the cabin's small table. The journal fragment, photographs he'd taken of the unusual stone arrangements, screenshots of his research. A picture was beginning to form, though he couldn't quite see its full shape yet. Someone had been running an operation in this forest long ago, something involving exotic animals, and somehow Shadow was connected to it. The complications started small. Mrs. Kowalski appeared on his porch one morning while Shadow was eating. Elias had been so focused on the cub that he hadn't heard her approach. She stood at the bottom of the steps, her eyes wide, hand pressed to her chest. "Elias," she said carefully, "is that what I think it is?" There was no point in lying. "It's a long story." "I imagine it is." She looked from Shadow to Elias and back again. "That's not legal, you know. Keeping an exotic animal." "I'm not keeping it," Elias said. "It keeps coming back on its own." Mrs. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Shadow had stopped eating and was watching her with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "My grandson would lose his mind if he knew there was a panther living in these woods," she said finally. "He's 8, obsessed with big cats." "Please don't tell anyone," Elias said. "I know how this looks, but I'm trying to figure out what's best. If Wildlife Services comes in, they'll take it away, put it in a cage somewhere. And there's something else going on here, something I don't understand yet." She studied him for a long moment. "You've changed since you moved here. You seem more settled, more like yourself, if that makes sense." "It does." "I won't say anything," she said, "but you be careful. There are people in town who wouldn't understand, who'd see a wild animal and only think about danger, not about whatever story brought it here." She paused. "And Elias, whatever you're looking for out here in these woods, I hope you find it." After she left, Elias sat on the porch steps, feeling the weight of her discretion like a gift he hadn't earned. Shadow finished eating and moved closer than it ever had before, settling into the shade beneath the porch, not quite touching him, but near enough that Elias could hear its breathing. The call from Iris came that night. "Dad, I've been thinking about fall break. I want to come visit." Elias's first instinct was to say no, to protect her from whatever complicated situation he'd gotten himself into. But then he thought about how much he missed her, how long it had been since they'd spent real time together. When? 2 weeks? Mum already said it's okay. She thinks the mountain air will be good for me. There was something in Iris's voice, a brightness he hadn't heard in a while. "And I want to meet Shadow." "I never said that's what I call it." "Dad, of course that's what you call it. You're predictable in the best ways." She paused. "Is that okay, me coming?" "More than okay," Elias said, and meant it. But after they hung up, worry crept in. What if Shadow didn't appear while Iris was here? Worse, what if something happened, if the cub felt threatened by a new person and reacted badly? Or what if Nora found out about the panther and decided he was creating unsafe conditions, used it as ammunition in some custody argument? He pushed the thoughts away. Iris was 16, not a child. She was smart, careful, and she loved animals. If anyone would understand what was happening here, it would be her. The next morning, Shadow brought him another gift. A brass compass, tarnished and old, half buried in the dirt near the porch steps. The cub sat beside it, waiting until Elias picked it up, then watched as he examined it. The compass was heavier than it looked, well made, with unusual symbols etched into its casing. Elias turned it over in his hands, noting how the needle didn't point north. Instead, it swung decisively toward the deep forest, toward a direction he'd never explored. The symbols matched nothing he recognized, but they had the look of indigenous markings, deliberate and meaningful. Shadow stood and walked a few steps toward the forest, then looked back at Elias. The message was clear. "Not yet," Elias said aloud, "but soon, I promise." The cub regarded him for another moment, then vanished into the trees. Elias stood holding the compass, feeling its weight, feeling the pull of whatever mystery it pointed toward. 2 weeks until Iris arrived. 2 weeks to decide how much further down this path he was willing to go. The compass sat on Elias's desk like an accusation. He'd spent hours examining it, photographing it from every angle, searching online for similar artifacts. The symbols etched into its brass casing were definitely indigenous. He'd found matches in historical records of the tribes who'd lived in this region before European settlement. But the compass itself was clearly made with European metalworking techniques, suggesting a collaboration or perhaps appropriation. What puzzled him most was the needle. It shouldn't work at all given how old the compass appeared, yet it swung with definite purpose toward the same direction every time. Not magnetic north, but something else. Somewhere else. Shadow continued to bring him objects. Small things. Unusual stones with holes worn through them, feathers from birds Elias couldn't identify, once a piece of carved wood so aged it crumbled when he touched it. Each item felt significant, though Elias couldn't say why. It was as if the cub was trying to tell him a story, one artifact at a time. He'd started keeping everything in a wooden box on his desk, arranging and rearranging the pieces like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The journal fragment with its mention of Project Sunk seemed key. He'd researched the phrase obsessively, finding nothing concrete but plenty of suggestive threads. Conservation movements in the 1,930 seconds. Wealthy eccentrics who'd tried to create private wildlife sanctuaries. The name that kept appearing in local historical records, Dr. Hugh Whitmore. Whitmore had been a naturalist and wealthy heir who'd purchased thousands of acres in this region in the late 1920 seconds. The records were sparse and often contradictory. Some described him as a visionary conservationist. Others called him eccentric, possibly unstable. He disappeared in 1936 under mysterious circumstances, and his land had eventually been sold off piecemeal by distant relatives who'd never seen it. The day before Iris was due to arrive, Elias drove into town to buy groceries and do more research at the small library. The librarian, an older man who seemed to know everything about local history, pulled out archived newspapers on microfilm when Elias mentioned Whitmore's name. "Ah, yes," the librarian said, "the hermit naturalist. There were rumors he'd gone mad, that he was keeping dangerous animals on his property. Some said he was running an illegal menagerie. Others thought he was protecting endangered species. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What happened to him? Nobody knows for certain. He was last seen in town in March of 1936, buying supplies. After that, the librarian made a gesture of something vanishing into air. Some thought he'd been killed by one of his own animals. Others suspected he'd simply walked into the forest and decided not to come back. The search parties never found a body." Elias leaned closer to the microfilm reader. "And his land? Scattered now, sold off in the 40s and 50s. Parts of it became logging territory. Other parts just went back to wilderness. Your cabin, if I'm not mistaken, sits on what used to be the southeastern corner of his original purchase." The information sat heavy in Elias's chest as he drove home. Shadow was waiting on the porch, and for the first time, Elias sat down beside the cub instead of keeping his distance. Shadow tensed but didn't move away. They sat like that for several minutes, man and animal both watching the forest as evening shadows lengthened. "You're trying to show me something," Elias said quietly. "Something about Whitmore, about what he was doing out here, aren't you?" Shadow turned its head, those dark eyes meeting his. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was not a normal animal. Whatever Whitmore had been doing, it had created something beyond natural. Iris arrived the next afternoon, her mother dropping her off with a car full of luggage that seemed excessive for a week's visit. Nora lingered just long enough to inspect the cabin with a critical eye and remind Elias about Iris's allergy medication and her homework schedule. "She needs this," Nora said before leaving, her voice softer than usual. "She's been stressed with school, college applications looming. Some time with her dad in the woods might be good for her." "I'll take care of her," Elias promised. After Nora left, Iris dumped her bags in the small bedroom and emerged with a huge grin. "Okay, where's the panther?" "Patience," Elias said. "Shadow comes and goes on its own schedule." But Shadow appeared within the hour, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. Iris was on the porch when the cub emerged from the tree line. She went completely still, her hand finding Elias's arm and gripping it tight. "Dad," she whispered, "that's really real. Very real." They watched Shadow approach, closer than it usually came, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. The cub looked at Iris with what seemed like curiosity, then sat and began grooming itself, apparently unconcerned. "Can I?" Iris started. "No touching," Elias said firmly. "It's wild, Iris. Comfortable with us doesn't mean tame." But over the next few days, Shadow seemed to accept Iris's presence completely. The cub would appear for morning feedings and stay longer, sometimes napping in the shade while Iris and Elias talked on the porch. Iris took hundreds of photos, documenting every detail, already planning the presentation she'd give when she went back to school. More importantly, she helped with the research. Iris had a sharper mind for puzzles than Elias did, and she brought fresh eyes to the artifacts and information he'd gathered. Together they pored over the compass, the journal fragment, the historical records about Whitmore. "Look at this," Iris said on the third evening, her laptop open beside the wooden box of artifacts. She'd been searching old land records and had found a map of Whitmore's original property. "See how his land had these weird boundaries? They don't follow natural features or property lines. They're deliberate, like he was protecting something specific." Elias studied the map. She was right. Whitmore's boundaries created a shape that enclosed certain areas while excluding others. What was he protecting? Or hiding? Iris said. She pulled up another window on her laptop. "I found some letters he wrote to a colleague at a university. He talks about preserving bloodlines and protecting specimens from those who would exploit them." "Dad, I think he was running a secret breeding program for endangered animals. In the 1,930 seconds, that would have been incredibly forward-thinking, or incredibly illegal, depending on how he got the animals." Iris looked at Shadow, who was sleeping peacefully in a patch of late sun. What if Shadow's family has been here all along, descended from animals Whitmore brought here? The implication settled over Elias like a weight. If Iris was right, Shadow wasn't just an escaped exotic pet. It was part of a legacy that had survived nearly a century in secret, and somehow it had chosen to reveal that legacy to him. That night, after Iris had gone to bed, Elias's phone rang. Nora's number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Elias," she said without preamble, "are you keeping a wild animal at that cabin?" His heart sank. "How did you—" Iris posted photos on social media. "A black panther, Elias. Really?" Her voice was tight with anger and fear. "I'm calling my lawyer in the morning. This is exactly the kind of reckless behavior that proves you shouldn't have unsupervised custody. Nora, please listen." But she'd already hung up. Elias sat in the dark cabin, the phone heavy in his hand, feeling everything he'd been building start to crumble. He could lose Iris over this, lose the fragile progress he'd made toward becoming the father she deserved. Shadow appeared at the window, face pressed to the glass, watching him with those knowing eyes. The compass on the desk seemed to glow in the moonlight, its needle pointing toward answers Elias wasn't sure he was ready to find. But he was running out of time to decide. Elias barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Nora's number on his phone screen, heard the anger in her voice. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He had to find out what Shadow was leading him toward. If there was truly something significant in the forest proof of Whitmore's sanctuary, evidence of a conservation effort that had succeeded in secret for decades, then maybe it would be enough. Enough to show he wasn't being reckless. Enough to prove this mattered. He woke Iris early. "We're going hiking today." The real kind. Not the trails close to the cabin. She sat up in bed, instantly alert. "You're going to follow the compass." "We're going to follow the compass," he corrected. "But we need to be smart about it. Tell your mother we're going on a day hike. Pack water, snacks, first aid kit. And Iris, no social media. Not a single post until we know what we're dealing with." "Dad, I'm sorry about—" "I know," he said, "but we can't change it now. We can only move forward." They prepared carefully. Elias packed his GPS unit, extra batteries, a satellite phone he'd bought after moving to the cabin but rarely used. He left a note for Mrs. Kowalski with their planned route and expected return time, sliding it under her door before she woke. Basic wilderness safety, the kind of thing he'd let slide when hiking alone but couldn't risk with his daughter. Shadow appeared as they were loading their packs and seemed to understand immediately. The cub moved to the forest edge and waited, looking back at them expectantly. "It knows," Iris said, wonder in her voice. "It always seems to know," Elias replied. They set out just after sunrise, following Shadow into parts of the forest Elias had never explored. The compass needle pulled them northwest, toward terrain that grew increasingly difficult. Old-growth forest gave way to steeper slopes, rocky outcroppings, dense underbrush that required careful navigation. Shadow moved with confidence, occasionally stopping to wait when they fell behind. The cub seemed to be following a specific route, avoiding certain areas while choosing paths that, while challenging, were navigable for humans. 3 hours in, they reached a waterfall. It wasn't large, maybe 20 feet high, but it was beautiful. A silver ribbon of water cascading over dark rock into a pool, so clear Elias could see smooth stones on the bottom. Shadow sat at the base of the falls and began digging at something. "What's it doing?" Iris asked. They approached carefully. Shadow had unearthed something from the soft soil, a stone medallion, roughly circular, maybe 4 inches across. Elias picked it up, brushing away dirt. The carving was unmistakable, a panther in profile, surrounded by symbols that matched the ones on the compass. The stone was worn smooth by time, but the carving remained clear, deliberate, purposeful. "This was made to be found," Elias said, turning it over in his hands. "Or kept safe, maybe both." Iris photographed it from every angle, while Elias examined the area around the waterfall. There were other signs now that he knew to look for. Stones arranged in patterns, trees marked with old carvings, the remnants of a trail that had been deliberately concealed but not completely erased. "Dad, look at this." Iris was crouched near the pool's edge, pointing at something carved into the rock face beside the falls. Symbols, weathered but still legible, and beneath them, barely visible, HW 1934, Hugh Whitmore. He'd been here, had marked this place. The waterfall wasn't just a natural feature, it was a waypoint, a marker on a journey towards something larger. They ate lunch, sitting on rocks beside the pool, Shadow stretched out in the sun nearby. Elias tried calling Nora on the satellite phone, but she didn't answer. He left a message, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. "I know you're angry. I understand why. But something important is happening here, and I need you to trust me. Give me a few more days to figure this out. Please." He didn't know if she'd listen. Probably not. But he had to try. "Tell me about Grandpa," Iris said suddenly. Elias looked at her, surprised. Why? Because you get this look sometimes, like you're remembering something sad. And I realized I barely know him. We've met maybe 5 times in my whole life. Elias sighed, watching the water flow over stones. Your grandfather and I, we were never good at talking to each other, even when I was your age. He had expectations about what kind of man I should be, and I had my own ideas, and neither of us knew how to bridge that gap. He paused. After your grandmother died, it got worse. She was the one who kept us connected. Without her, we just drifted. That's sad, Iris said quietly. It is. And it's something I think about more now, being out here. How time passes, how people become strangers when they don't make the effort. He looked at his daughter. I don't want that to happen with us, Iris. Whatever happens with your mother, whatever legal complications come from all this, I don't want us to drift. We won't, she said firmly. You're different now, Dad. You're actually present. Before, even when you were there physically, your mind was somewhere else. But now, you're really here. Shadow suddenly lifted its head, alert. A moment later, Elias heard it too, voices in the distance growing closer. He and Iris exchanged a glance. Behind the falls, Elias whispered. Now. They scrambled into the shallow cave created by the waterfall's overhang, Shadow following silently. Through the curtain of water, they could see 2 figures emerge into the clearing. Men, both carrying expensive hiking gear and what looked like tracking equipment. The coordinates were accurate, one said, examining a GPS unit. This is definitely part of the old Whitmore property. Any sign of the animal? The other asked. Nothing yet, but the thermal signatures from last week suggest something large moving through this area regularly. If there really is a breeding population of melanistic leopards here. He paused. Do you know what that would be worth? Not just the animals themselves, but the genetic data, the proof that they've survived this long in isolation. Elias felt Iris tense beside him. He put a hand on her arm, warning her to stay silent. Shadow was completely still, barely breathing, watching the men with focused intensity. The men spent 20 minutes examining the area, taking samples, photographing the markings on the rock. Then they moved on, following a trail that led away from the waterfall in the wrong direction. Elias waited until he couldn't hear them anymore before speaking. We need to move fast now. Someone else knows about Shadow, about what's out here, and they're not looking to protect it. Who were they? Iris whispered. I don't know, but we need to find what Shadow's been trying to show us before they do. He looked at the compass, its needle still pointing northwest. Come on, we're running out of time. They moved faster now, urgency driving them forward. Shadow seemed to sense the change in mood and picked up the pace, leading them along paths that grew increasingly difficult to navigate. The forest here felt older, wilder, as if they'd crossed some invisible boundary into a place where human presence was rare. Elias marked their route carefully with his GPS, dropping waypoints every few hundred yards. If they needed to get out quickly, or if others needed to find this place, he wanted a clear trail. The men at the waterfall had changed everything. This wasn't just about satisfying his own curiosity anymore, it was about protecting whatever Shadow was leading them toward. 2 hours past the waterfall, Shadow stopped abruptly in a clearing that felt different from the rest of the forest. The trees here were arranged in a way that seemed too regular to be natural, forming a rough circle around a massive Douglas fir that had to be centuries old. Its trunk was easily 20 feet around, its lowest branches starting 40 feet up, its crown disappearing into the canopy above. The grandfather tree, Elias murmured, remembering the phrase from the journal fragment. Shadow approached the base of the tree and began pawing at the ground near its roots. Iris and Elias joined the search, using their hands to clear away decades of accumulated forest debris, needles, leaves, small branches, moss. Within minutes they found it, a hollow beneath the roots, and inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth, another artifact. Elias carefully extracted the package. The oilcloth was old but had done its job, keeping the contents dry. Inside was a folded piece of thick paper, yellowed with age but intact. He unfolded it gently, Iris leaning close to see. It was a map, hand-drawn, incredibly detailed, showing an underground complex of chambers and tunnels. Labels marked various rooms: main chamber, specimens, archives, emergency exit. At the center of the map, beneath a symbol that matched the medallion, were the words Project Sanctuary, 1933. It's underground, Iris breathed. That's why no one ever found it. He built it underground. Elias studied the map carefully. According to the legend in the corner, the entrance was here, beneath the grandfather tree. He looked at the massive roots, trying to imagine how someone could have constructed an underground facility without heavy equipment, in secret, nearly a century ago. This would have taken years, he said, and significant resources. He was wealthy, Iris reminded him, and determined. She pointed to a notation on the map. Look, there are ventilation shafts marked, and water sources. He designed this to be sustainable, long-term. Shadow had moved to a specific spot between two large roots and was scratching at the ground with purpose. Elias and Iris joined the digging, this time more systematic, clearing away soil and debris in a widening circle. 15 minutes of work revealed what they were looking for: stone, carefully fitted blocks forming a frame and set into that frame. A door, Iris whispered. It was small, maybe 4 feet high, built low and designed to blend with the natural terrain. The stone was covered in moss and lichen, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And set into the door, tarnished but unmistakable, was a keyhole. Elias pulled the rusted key from his pocket, the one Shadow had brought him weeks ago. His hand trembled slightly as he inserted it into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound of metal on metal, something inside the mechanism gave way. The door shifted inward slightly. "Dad," Iris said, her voice tight with emotion. "This is real. All of it. He really built this." Before Elias could respond, his satellite phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Kowalski. "Men at my cabin asking about you. Told them you were hiking. Didn't mention direction. Be careful." Elias showed the message to Iris. "They're closer than we thought. What do we do?" He looked at the door, then at the map, then at Shadow, who sat watching them with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to document what they'd found and contact proper authorities. But the men tracking them weren't authorities, they were something else, and if they found this place first, found the sanctuary that Whitmore had protected for so long, what would they do with it? "We go in," Elias decided, "but quickly. We document what's there, take photos of everything, and then we seal it back up and get out. We'll have proof of what Whitmore created, and we can use that to protect it properly." "Are you sure?" Elias thought about his daughter, standing beside him in the wilderness, trusting him to make the right choice. He thought about Nora's threats and the custody battle that might be coming. He thought about the man in the photograph on his mantle, the one who could be brave when it mattered. "I'm sure," he said. Together, they pulled the door open. It was heavy, balanced perfectly despite its age, swinging inward to reveal a passageway descending into darkness. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying the scent of earth and stone and something else, the faint smell of animals, though whether current or ghostly echoes from the past, Elias couldn't tell. Shadow entered without hesitation, disappearing into the darkness. Elias pulled out his flashlight, checked that Iris had hers as well, and took a deep breath. "Stay close to me," he said. "We don't know what's down there." "Dad?" Iris's voice was small. "What if something goes wrong?" He turned to look at her. His daughter, who'd grown up while he wasn't paying attention, who was brave enough to follow him into the unknown. Then, We face it together. But Iris, I need you to promise me something. If I tell you to run, if I tell you to get out, you do it. No arguments. You get back to Mrs. Kowalski's and you call for help. Promise me." "I promise," she said, though he could hear the reluctance in her voice. They descended into the earth, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The passage was narrow at first, barely wide enough for Elias's shoulders, but it widened as they went deeper. The walls were reinforced with timber beams, old but still solid, showing signs of skilled craftsmanship. Someone had built this to last. After what felt like 50 yards, but might have been less in the disorienting darkness, the passage opened into a chamber. Elias's flashlight beam found the walls, then swept across to reveal the space, and his breath caught in his throat. They'd found it. Whitmore's sanctuary. And it was far more than he'd imagined. The chamber was enormous, easily 40 feet across, with a ceiling supported by timber beams that showed remarkable engineering for the 1,930 seconds. Natural light filtered down through concealed shafts above, creating columns of dusty illumination that revealed the space in stages. The air was surprisingly fresh, testament to Whitmore's ventilation design. But it was the contents that left Elias speechless. One wall was lined with shelves containing dozens of leather-bound journals, specimen jars, and carefully labeled boxes. Another held filing cabinets, their drawers slightly open as if someone had left in a hurry. A large desk sat in the center, covered with papers weighted down by stones, and everywhere on the walls, hanging from hooks, stored in protective cases, were artifacts. Tribal masks, ceremonial objects, photographs in frames, maps, drawings of animals both living and extinct. "This is a museum," Iris whispered. "He created an entire museum underground." Shadow moved through the space with familiarity, as if it had been here before. The cub led them to the desk, where the papers waited. Elias approached carefully, aware that he was touching history that had been undisturbed for decades. The topmost document was a letter, handwritten in elegant script, addressed, "To whoever finds this." Elias's hands shook as he picked it up and began to read aloud. "If you are reading this, then the Guardians have deemed you worthy. I can only hope their judgment was sound. My name is Hugh Whitmore, and what you see before you is my life's greatest work and my deepest shame. I was hired in 1924 by a consortium of wealthy industrialists to acquire exotic animals for their private collections. They wanted status symbols, tigers, leopards, bears, creatures they could display to demonstrate their power and wealth. I was young, ambitious, and I told myself I was a scientist, not a poacher. But that distinction meant nothing to the animals dying in cramped cages, separated from their families, bred until they were broken. By 1928, I could no longer stomach what I'd become. I'd seen too much cruelty, too much waste, species being driven to extinction to satisfy vanity, families destroyed. But I'd also gathered something valuable: proof. Shipping manifests, transaction records, photographs of the criminals involved. Evidence that could destroy the men who'd hired me. They threatened me when I tried to leave, threatened my family. So I made a choice. I would disappear, but not before creating something that mattered. Project Sanctuary. Elias paused, looking at Iris. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the letter. He continued, "I used my remaining resources to purchase this land and build this place. I released most of the animals I'd acquired, giving them whatever chance at freedom I could. But some were too rare, too endangered, too special to simply let go. The melanistic leopards, especially there, were only 4 breeding pairs left in the world at that time, and 2 of those pairs were in my possession. I kept them, not in cages, but in protected territory. I bred them carefully, documented their bloodlines, and trained their descendants to be more than animals, to be guardians, protectors of this place and everything it contains. Because this sanctuary holds more than animals, it holds the truth, Names of the men who profited from extinction, proof of their crimes, documents that could still ruin their families even generations later. I've hidden it all here, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. But I knew they would come for me eventually. By the time you read this, I will likely be dead. They cannot allow me to live with what I know. The final entry in my personal journal will tell you when they're coming. After that silence, I leave this burden to you, stranger. Use this evidence as you see fit. Expose the truth or keep it buried. But know this, the Guardians will watch. They always have. If you prove worthy, they will help you. If you prove false, they will ensure this place remains hidden forever. May you have more courage than I did in the end. Hugh Whitmore, the 15th of March, 1936. The date sent a chill through Elias. That was just days before Whitmore disappeared. He set down the letter carefully and looked around the chamber with new understanding. This wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a time capsule, a deliberate act of preservation, waiting for the right moment, the right person. "Dad," Iris said, pointing to a metal box on the desk. "What's that?" The box was sealed, about the size of a shoebox, with a small plaque on top reading, "Evidence, do not destroy." Elias opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, showing wealthy men posing with exotic animals, trophy photos, but also shipping documents, ledgers showing transactions, and most damning letters discussing the deliberate hunting of endangered species, the manipulation of conservation laws, the bribery of officials. "These names," Elias said, sorting through the documents. He recognized several, families that were still prominent, still wealthy, still powerful. If this became public, it would destroy them, Iris finished. "That's why those men are looking for this place. They're descendants, aren't they? They know what's hidden here, and they want to make sure it stays buried." Elias pulled out his phone and began photographing everything. The letters, the shipping manifests, the photographs. If nothing else, they'd have digital proof of what Whitmore had preserved. But even as he worked, his mind raced through the implications. This wasn't treasure in the traditional sense. The gold relics and tribal artifacts were valuable, yes, but the real treasure was information. Dangerous information. The kind that could end careers, destroy family legacies, potentially even lead to criminal investigations if the statute of limitations hadn't expired on some of these crimes. He found Whitmore's personal journal in a drawer. The last entry dated the 18th of March, 1936. "They're coming. I can feel it. 3 days ago, I received a final warning delivered by men who didn't bother to hide their faces. They know I won't cooperate. Tomorrow, I'll seal the sanctuary and prepare for their arrival. I'm not brave enough to publish what I know while I'm alive. Perhaps that makes me a coward, but I've ensured the truth will survive, even if I don't. The Guardians understand their purpose. They will wait for someone worthy, someone braver than I was." The final line was underscored 3 times. "Let the Guardians decide." Shadow suddenly growled, a low sound that made the hair on Elias's neck stand up. The cub was staring at the entrance passage, body tense, ears flat. "Someone's coming," Iris whispered. Elias listened. Voices, distant but getting closer. The men from the waterfall had found them. He looked at the evidence box, at his daughter, at Shadow. They were trapped underground, with proof that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep hidden. And the men coming down that passage weren't going to let them leave with it. Elias's mind raced. The entrance passage was the only way they'd come in, and it was narrow, defensible maybe, but also a trap if they couldn't get past whoever was coming. He grabbed the map he'd found earlier and studied it by flashlight, searching for the emergency exit Whitmore had marked. "There," he pointed to a notation on the far side of the chamber. "Secondary tunnel leads out 1/2 mile from here." "Will it still be passable?" Iris asked, her voice tight with fear. "Only one way to find out." He quickly packed the evidence box into his backpack, along with Whitmore's personal journal and several of the most damaging documents. His phone was full of photographs, hundreds of them. Even if they lost the physical evidence, they'd have digital proof. The voices were closer now, echoing in the entrance passage. Elias could make out words: thermal signatures led here, and keep the animal alive if possible. Worth more that way. They weren't here for the historical value. They wanted Shadow and whatever other descendants of Whitmore's leopards might still exist. Genetic material. Proof of a successful breeding program. Worth millions to the right buyers. Go, Elias whispered to Iris, pointing toward a dark opening at the back of the chamber that must lead to the emergency tunnel. Shadow was already moving in that direction, as if it knew exactly where to go. Iris hesitated. What about you? I need to slow them down. Buy us time. He pulled out his satellite phone and pressed it into her hands. Take this. If you get out, and I don't call Paulina Greaves at the Seattle Tribune, she's an investigative journalist, someone I went to college with. Her number's in my contacts. Tell her everything. Send her the photos from my cloud backup. She'll know what to do. Dad. No. Iris. He gripped her shoulders, looking her in the eyes. I need you to trust me. I need you to be brave. Can you do that? She nodded, tears starting to form. I promise I'll be careful. I know you will. Now go. Shadow will guide you. Iris disappeared into the tunnel, Shadow at her heels. Elias watched until their flashlight beams faded, then turned back to the chamber. He had maybe 2 minutes before the men reached the main room. He needed a plan. The filing cabinets. He started pulling them over, creating obstacles in the entrance passage. They were heavy, solid, metal, and they fell with crashes that echoed through the chamber. Papers scattered everywhere, but he didn't care. He just needed to make it difficult for anyone to get through quickly. He found an old crowbar in a tool cabinet. Whitmore had been prepared for maintenance and wedged it into the doorframe, making it harder to open all the way. Then he extinguished his flashlight and moved into the shadows at the side of the chamber, near the tunnel where Iris had gone. The first man appeared at the entrance, silhouetted by the glow of his headlamp. He was in his 40s, wearing expensive outdoor gear, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Behind him came a younger man, similarly equipped, with what looked like a tranquilizer rifle slung over his shoulder. Well, the first man said, surveying the chaos of overturned cabinets and scattered papers. Someone's been busy. They can't have gone far, the younger one said. There's only one way out. Actually, Elias said from the shadows, there are two. Both men spun toward his voice. The first one smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Hartley, I presume? I'm Kenneth Ashford. I believe you've stumbled onto something that belongs to my family. Nothing here belongs to you, Elias said, keeping his voice steady. This is a protected historical site, and you're trespassing. Protected? Ashford laughed. This land is private property, purchased by my great-grandfather in 1937. Everything in it belongs to the Ashford estate, including, I might add, any animals that have been living here illegally for the past 90 years. So that was it. The Ashford family had bought Whitmore's land after his disappearance, probably knowing exactly what might be hidden here. They'd been searching for decades, and now they'd finally found it. I've already documented everything, Elias said. Photographed every document, every piece of evidence Whitmore left behind. Even if you stop me, the truth is already backed up in the cloud. Multiple locations. Ashford's expression hardened. Then we'll need your phone. And your camera. And anything else you use to take those pictures. Hand them over, and we can all walk away from this. And if I don't? The younger man raised the tranquilizer rifle slightly. We came prepared for uncooperative wildlife. Works just as well on humans, though I'm told the dosage can be tricky. Too much and well, accidents happen in the wilderness. Elias's heart pounded. He'd bought Iris maybe 5 minutes, but was it enough? The emergency tunnel could be blocked, could lead nowhere. He might have sent his daughter into a dead end while he stood here playing for time. "The journalist I sent the files to," he said, stalling. "She's already writing the story. Names, dates, everything. Your family's involvement in illegal wildlife trafficking, the evidence Whitmore collected. By tomorrow morning—" "You're lying," Ashford said. "You haven't had time. You just found this place today. We've been monitoring your movements. And according to our equipment, there are 2 heat signatures in that tunnel behind you. Your daughter, presumably, and one of the leopards. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to call her back. We're going to retrieve what belongs to us. And then we're all going to forget this ever happened." "No," Elias said simply. "No." Ashford stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Hartley. My family has protected our reputation for 4 generations. We've silenced more determined people than you. Whitmore himself learned that lesson. Do you really want your daughter to learn it too?" The threat hung in the air like poison. Elias felt rage building in his chest, hot and clarifying. These were the kind of men who thought power meant they could do whatever they wanted, who saw animals as property and people as obstacles. The same kind of men who'd driven Whitmore into hiding and probably to his death. "You want to know what I've learned out here?" Elias said, his voice low. "I've learned that some things are worth fighting for, that staying silent to stay safe is just another way of dying. And I've learned that my daughter deserves a father who stands up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." He pulled out his lighter. He'd quit smoking years ago, but kept it as a reminder and held it near a pile of papers. "These documents? They're originals, irreplaceable, and they're soaked in 90-year-old oil from the preservation process. One spark, and this whole chamber goes up." "You're bluffing," Ashford said, but uncertainty crossed his face. "Try me," Elias said. "My daughter's already safe with copies of everything. Burn it all down, and you just prove how guilty you are." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Shadow's roar echoed from somewhere in the tunnels, not the small cry of a cub, but something deeper, fuller, adult. And it wasn't alone. Other voices joined it, a chorus of sounds that spoke of family, of guardians who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Ashford's face went pale. "How many are there?" "Enough," Elias said. "This was never about one cub. It was about a legacy that survived when everyone thought it had died. Now get out, and pray the journalist I contacted is feeling generous." The roars echoed again through the tunnels, closer now, and the younger man with the tranquilizer rifle took an involuntary step backward. Ashford held his ground, but Elias could see the calculation in his eyes. Whatever confidence he'd had about controlling this situation was crumbling. "You can't prove anything," Ashford said, but his voice had lost its edge. "Old documents, grainy photos. My lawyers will tear it apart. It'll be your word against a family that's been respectable for a century." "Your great-grandfather hired Whitmore to traffic endangered species," Elias said. "There are shipping manifests with his signature. Letters discussing payments. He wasn't just complicit, he was running the operation. And according to these documents, your family continued the business well into the 50s. Some of these crimes are recent enough that they might still be prosecutable." The truth of it hit Ashford visibly. His jaw tightened. "Give me the evidence box, the journals, everything physical. You can keep your photos, they're useless without originals to authenticate them." "No deal," Elias said. "The only thing you're getting from me is a head start to call your lawyers, because by tomorrow this story breaks wide open." A sound from the entrance passage made them all turn. More voices, more lights. Ashford's expression shifted to confusion. "I didn't bring anyone else." "But we did," came a woman's voice. Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the entrance, but she wasn't alone. Behind her were 2 state park rangers and a county sheriff's deputy, all looking at the scene with professional assessment. The deputy's hand rested on his sidearm. "Mrs. Kowalski," Elias said, shocked. "You left me a note with your route, dear," she said calmly. "And when those men came asking questions with guns and tracking equipment, I decided to make a few calls. Turns out the sheriff's office has been wanting to talk to Mr. Ashford here about some illegal wildlife transactions." Ashford's face went from pale to red. "This is private property." "Actually," one of the rangers said, checking a tablet, "this land is part of a disputed estate. The Whitmore Trust has been in litigation for decades. Until that's resolved, it's under state protection, which means you, sir, are trespassing. And if those weapons aren't properly licensed—" "We're leaving," Ashford said quickly. He grabbed the younger man's arm and pushed toward the entrance. The deputy moved to block their path. "Not so fast. We'll need statements from everyone, and if there's evidence of protected species being harassed—" "I want my lawyer," Ashford said. While the deputy dealt with Ashford and his associate, Elias moved quickly to the tunnel entrance. "Iris," he called down into the darkness. "It's safe. Come back." He waited, heart pounding, until he saw flashlight beams approaching. Iris emerged first, dirty and scraped but unhurt, followed by Shadow. But behind them, Elias's breath caught. 2 adult panthers, their coats gleaming black in the flashlight beams, moved with fluid grace. They were magnificent, larger than Shadow, clearly mature. And bringing up the rear, 3 more cubs, slightly older than Shadow, their eyes bright with curiosity. "Oh my God," one of the rangers breathed. "Melanistic leopards," Elias said, "descendants of the animals Dr. Hugh Whitmore protected in the 1932. They've been here all along." The adult panthers moved protectively around the cubs, but they showed no aggression. They simply watched the humans with the same uncanny intelligence that Shadow displayed. Guardians, Whitmore had called them. Protectors of this place and its secrets. "Dad," Iris said, rushing to him. He pulled her into a tight hug, feeling her trembling. "The tunnel it opened into chambers where they live. There's a whole system down there. Water, ventilation, everything they'd need. And Dad, there are journals. Whitmore's descendants. Someone's been taking care of them all this time." "What?" Elias pulled back to look at her. "Not descendants of Whitmore," Iris clarified. "Descendants of the indigenous people who originally lived here. The symbols on the compass, the medallion, they're tribal markers. Whitmore didn't do this alone. He had help, and that help continued after he died. Someone's been protecting this place for 90 years. One of the rangers was already on his radio, calling for backup, for wildlife specialists, for what sounded like half the state government. The other was photographing the panthers with shaking hands. Mrs. Kowalski appeared at Elias's side. "You found something important," she said. It wasn't a question. "More important than I imagined," Elias replied. He pulled out the evidence box. "This is going to cause a lot of trouble for a lot of powerful people." "Good," she said firmly. "Some trouble is overdue." The deputy had handcuffed Ashford and his associate, reading them their rights. Ashford glared at Elias with pure hatred. "This isn't over. My family has resources you can't imagine. We'll bury you in lawsuits." "Save it for your lawyer," the deputy said, guiding him toward the entrance. As they disappeared up the passage, Elias felt the weight of the past hours crash over him. His legs went weak, and he sat down hard on the floor, Iris immediately beside him. "We did it," she said quietly. "Dad, we actually did it." "You did it," Elias corrected. "Getting Mrs. Kowalski to call for help, that was smart thinking." "I texted her from your phone before I went into the tunnel," Iris admitted. "Figured we needed backup either way." Elias laughed, the sound bordering on hysteria. His daughter had saved them with a simple text message, while he'd been playing hero with a lighter and empty threats. Shadow approached and butted its head against his knee, a gesture of affection or perhaps approval. The adult panthers watched from a distance, still protective, but no longer wary. They seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed. One of the rangers approached carefully. "Mr. Hartley, we're going to need you and your daughter to stay here while we secure the site. There's going to be a lot of people coming, federal wildlife officials, historians, probably the media once word gets out. This is," he shook his head, "this is the discovery of a lifetime." The sanctuary became a controlled chaos over the next hours. Wildlife specialists arrived with proper equipment to document the panther family. Historians from the State University came to catalogue Whitmore's artifacts and journals. And through it all, Elias sat with Iris on the steps of the main chamber, watching the careful preservation of something that had stayed hidden for nearly a century. A woman in her 60s approached them, her credentials identifying her as Dr. June Lockwood, a wildlife geneticist from the University of Washington. "Mr. Hartley, I need to ask you about the panthers. How long have you been in contact with them?" "About 3 weeks," Elias said. "Just the cub at first shadow. The others we only saw today." Dr. Lockwood's eyes widened. 3 weeks of daily contact with a wild, melanistic leopard, and you're unharmed. That's extraordinary. They're typically quite dangerous, especially protective mothers. She gestured toward the adult female who was watching them from across the chamber. "That one there? She could kill you in seconds if she wanted to. The fact that she's tolerating our presence at all is remarkable." "They're not typical," Iris said. "Dr. Whitmore, he wrote, that he trained them, not to be tame, but to be guardians, to recognize when humans meant harm and when they didn't. Selective breeding for temperament, combined with some kind of socialization protocol." Dr. Lockwood mused. "If that's true, if these animals really have been bred for intelligence and discernment over 4 generations, she shook her head. The genetic implications alone would revolutionize our understanding of behavioral evolution." Shadow approached Dr. Lockwood and sat at her feet, tilting its head in that characteristic way. She crouched slowly, offering her hand. The cub sniffed it, then allowed her to touch its head briefly before moving away. "Incredible," she whispered. "He's assessing me, deciding if I'm safe." A state police investigator joined them, a weathered man named Captain Hugh Morris. "Mr. Hartley, I've been going through the documents you found. Some of these names," he glanced at his notes, "several are still prominent in state politics and business. This is going to create shockwaves." "Good," Elias said firmly. "These families built their wealth on extinction and cruelty. They don't deserve to hide behind respectability." "I agree, but I need to warn you they'll come after you legally. Defamation suits, harassment charges, anything to discredit you before this goes public." He paused. "You're going to need protection, legal representation at minimum." "I can help with that," came a voice from the entrance. Elias turned to see a woman in her 40s, professional attire now covered in dirt from the trek through the forest. She held out her hand. "Paulina Greaves, Seattle Tribune. Mrs. Kowalski called me hours ago and I drove straight here. I've already been briefed by the rangers, and Elias," she smiled, "this is the story of a lifetime. If you're willing to work with me, I can make sure the truth comes out before the Ashfords and their lawyers can spin it." Elias took her hand, remembering the old friendship from college, the shared classes and late-night study sessions. "Paulina, I was going to call you." "I know. Your daughter told me when I arrived." She pulled out a recording device. "I need your full statement, everything from the moment you found that cub. And I'll need access to the documents, the photos, everything. We break this story tomorrow morning, before they know what hit them." They talked for over an hour, Elias recounting every detail while Paulina recorded and took notes. Iris added her perspective, showing Paulina the photos she'd taken of the evidence, the journals, the panthers themselves. By the time they finished, Paulina's eyes were bright, with the kind of fervor only journalists hunting a major story possessed. "This is Pulitzer material," she said quietly. "Elias, you've handed me proof of crimes spanning a century, a successful conservation program that shouldn't exist, and a human interest story that's going to have people crying into their morning coffee. But I need to be clear, your life is about to change. Dramatically. Are you ready for that? Elias looked at Iris, who nodded encouragement. He thought about the man he'd been 8 months ago, defeated and directionless, hiding in the woods from a life he'd failed to build. Then he thought about the man he'd become, someone who'd followed a wild animal into the unknown and found not just a hidden sanctuary, but himself. "I'm ready," he said. As night fell, they finally emerged from the sanctuary. The forest was full of temporary lights now, generators humming, official vehicles parked in a clearing that had been untouched wilderness that morning. Elias felt disoriented by the transformation, by how quickly the secret had become public knowledge. His satellite phone rang. Nora's number. He answered with trepidation. "Elias." Her voice was strange, tight with emotion he couldn't identify. "I just got a call from a state police captain. He told me what happened today, what you and Iris found." "Nora, I can explain. He told me you protected our daughter, that you got her out safely when armed men showed up, that you'd made sure she had backup and an escape route." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "He said you were brave and smart, and that Iris told everyone her father was a hero." Elias felt his throat tighten. "I just did what I had to do." "I know. That's what he said too." Another pause. "I'm dropping the custody complaint. You're a good father, Elias. I forgot that for a while. We both did. Thank you," he managed. "Take care of yourself. And, Elias, I'm proud of you." She hung up before he could respond. Elias stood in the darkness, holding the phone, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. 3 months passed like a dream, or maybe like waking from one. Paulina's story broke on a Tuesday morning, front page of the Seattle Tribune, with a headline that read, "Hidden Sanctuary." How one man and a panther cub exposed a century of wildlife crimes. The article was everything Elias could have hoped for. Thorough, compassionate, devastating in its documentation of the Ashford family's legacy. By Wednesday, it had gone national. By Friday, international conservation groups were calling it one of the most significant wildlife discoveries in decades. And by the following Monday, 3 of the families named in Whitmore's documents had issued public apologies and pledged millions to conservation efforts in what their lawyers probably hoped was damage control. The Ashford family fought hardest, as Elias had known they would. Their lawyers filed motions, issued statements, tried everything to discredit both Whitmore's evidence and Elias himself. But the documentation was too thorough, the paper trail too clear. Kenneth Ashford was arrested on charges of attempted theft of protected artifacts and threatening witnesses. His lawyers were still fighting, but the family's reputation was in ruins. The sanctuary itself had been declared a protected historical site and wildlife preserve. The legal details were still being worked out: Whitmore's estate, the tribal land claims, federal and state jurisdiction. But everyone agreed on one thing: the panthers and their home would be protected. And Elias had been hired as its first official guardian and historian. He stood on his cabin porch now, coffee in hand, watching the morning mist rise through the trees. So much had changed, yet this moment felt familiar, comfortable. The cabin was still his refuge, but it no longer felt like hiding. It felt like home. Shadow emerged from the tree line, bigger now, adolescent rather than cub. The young panther had returned to the sanctuary's deeper chambers with its family, but visited most mornings, as if checking on Elias. Or maybe just maintaining a friendship that had started with mutual trust and grown into something neither of them had expected. "Morning," Elias said, setting down a plate of food. Shadow ate while Elias drank his coffee, the routine as natural as breathing. A car approached on the dirt road Iris, arriving for the weekend. She came every other week now, sometimes with friends who wanted to see the legendary sanctuary. She'd become something of a celebrity at school, the girl whose father had discovered a hidden conservation program and exposed powerful criminals. She handled it with grace, though Elias knew she sometimes found the attention overwhelming. "Shadow!" she called, climbing out of her car. The panther bounded over, allowing her to scratch behind its ears in a gesture of affection that still made Elias nervous, despite knowing Shadow's temperament. "How's school?" Elias asked as she joined him on the porch. "Good. MIT accepted my early application." "Iris, that's incredible." He pulled her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." "Environmental science program," she said, grinning. "Figured I should study what I'm already living. Plus, they were impressed by my field experience with endangered species conservation." They spent the morning hiking to the sanctuary, which now had proper trails and safety measures installed. A small visitor center was being built at a respectful distance, designed to allow limited public access while protecting the panther's privacy. Elias had consulted on every detail, determined that Whitmore's vision of protection would be honored. Inside the sanctuary, they found Dr. Lockwood and her team doing their weekly population assessment. The panther family had revealed itself to be larger than initially thought, 12 individuals total, ranging from cubs to elders. All descendants of Whitmore's original pairs, all carrying genetics that could help save their species. "Elias." "Perfect timing," Dr. Lockwood said. "Come see this." She led them to a chamber they'd only recently excavated, one of Whitmore's deeper archives. On the wall was a mural, painted in faded but still beautiful colors. It showed humans and panthers together, not as master and pet, but as equals, as partners. And beneath it, in Whitmore's handwriting, "For whoever finds this, you have proven worthy, not by power or wealth, but by compassion and courage. Guard what I have built. Let it teach future generations that protection is the highest calling, that some truths must be preserved, even at great cost, and that the wild things of this world deserve champions who will risk everything for their survival. You are that champion now. May you carry this burden with more grace than I did." Elias read it twice, feeling the weight of Whitmore's words, the responsibility they carried, but also the gift, purpose, meaning, a life that mattered. Mrs. Kowalski joined them for dinner that evening, bringing pie and stories about the flood of tourists trying to find the cabin. "I've been sending them all to the official visitor center," she said with a mischievous smile. "But a few of the more persistent ones I redirected to the Ashford estate. Figured they could use some public attention." Elias laughed, something he found himself doing often these days. His father had called last week, the first real conversation they'd had in years. The news coverage had reached him, and pride had overcome decades of stubborn silence. They were talking again, carefully rebuilding what had broken. As night fell, and Iris and Mrs. Kowalski headed home, Elias walked to the sanctuary entrance one more time. The bronze plaque was there now, installed just that week. "Whitmore Hartley Sanctuary, established 1933, rediscovered 2024, in honor of Dr. Hugh Whitmore, who gave everything to protect the voiceless, and Elias Hartley, who gave them voice. May all who enter here remember that true wealth is measured not in gold, but in the legacy we leave for generations yet to come." Shadow appeared beside him, no longer alone. The adult, female, the mother, the matriarch stood there too, regarding Elias with those intelligent eyes. She dipped her head slightly, a gesture he'd learned meant acceptance, respect. "Thank you," Elias said softly, "for choosing me, for trusting me." The panther turned and melted into the darkness, Shadow following. Elias stood alone under the stars, thinking about the man in the photograph on his mantle, the one who could be brave when it mattered. He'd found that man again, not by searching, but by following where compassion led. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what truly matters. And sometimes what truly matters finds you.